Practice podcast. This is Sayyam, your host. Thank you so much for tuning in. And today we have a very, very, very special guest with us. Now, this is a man who's a mythologist, an author, an illustrator, and an excellent speaker as well. And by that, of course, I'm talking about the great Mr. Devdutt Pattanaik. Hello, sir. How are you?
Hi.
It is very good to have you here. Honestly, I've been a fan for a long time, and it is great that we're able to do this.
Thank you.
So, you are a mythologist, right? And this, I know for a fact that this is a question you must have answered gajillion times by now, but what exactly is a myth? What is mythology? How is it different from history? And why is it important to study mythology?
So mythology is a cultural truth. So it is a culture has its own truth about the world, about life and why they exist. So every culture around the world and it is a glue that binds the people of that culture together. So that's the definition of culture. It's the truth of that culture only. Now history, it's basically a set of stories, a set of symbols, a set of rituals that communicate to a people their cultural truths. Now history is about trying to find what actually happened in the past, for which it seeks evidence. Right, so it's a new subject. 200 years ago, the subject of history did not exist anywhere in the world. It emerged only 150 years ago, where the scientific process is applied to understand our past. And therefore, we look at evidence. Without evidence, without doubt, you cannot create history. So the production of history happens based on evidence. While mythology has been there around for as long as there are human beings, the moment human beings became conscious and started asking questions like why does life exist, why does the world exist, what is happening after death, who am I, who do I belong to, what is my roots, the stories began. And when the stories began, we had the mythology. So a study of mythology helps us understand a culture. Study of history does not help us understand a culture. It only tells us what happened in the past in a very systematic, logical way.
Right. So do you reckon it would be fair to say that history is finding out what the objective truth was and mythology is more concerned with the beliefs of a culture?
Yes, it is. But the thing is, when you are writing history for someone, the author, the historian brings a subjectivity into it. So he will say things like, depending on whether he admires a king or does not admire a king, the way he presents the story of a king. So how do you objectively describe a war? A simple word, I'll give you an example. Man A kills man B. Now, depending on the history, that is objective. I know this man killed this man. But depending on the historian, this act can be an act of revolution, this can be an assassination, this can be an act of murder, this can be revenge. So all these subjective words percolate into it. So history is you have to know the historian well enough to understand where is he coming from.
Right.
And therefore it is a very contested space because different historians will bring in their own view. They try to keep it out of it as much as possible. I'll give you an example. For many of us, the assumption is that Ashoka, the king, Emperor Ashoka was a Buddhist, and he practiced when he uses the word Dhamma because he established stupas. He was propagating Buddhism. Now, this is an idea which historians had in the 1950s. However, as historians started doing study better and better today, when you read the latest research, they will say, no, well, maybe his personal faith was influenced by Buddhism, but he does not seem to be particularly inclined to Buddhism. When he uses the word dharma, he's really talking about civil religion and civic religion. He seems to be respecting Buddhists. He uses the word Shramanas and Brahmanas in the same breath. And therefore, it doesn't seem like he seems to be an overly Buddhist guy, although Buddhist texts claim that he was super Buddhist and he was like the super, and that's what unfortunately people in the 1950s thought. But history has changed as scholars improved their techniques, then their understanding of Ashoka changed, and today we have a very different understanding of Ashoka, which is not the popular understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Now, mythology will not change over time. It
Right.
will remain the same. Ramayana told 50 years ago and Ramayana told today will be the same story. What you derive out of it will vary, but the story doesn't change. Ramayana 2000 years ago was told. 1500 years ago was told. And each time there was new flavors added to it, and which a mythologist will try to understand, okay, how did the story of mythology, what is Ramayana A trying to communicate? And then you realize in different periods of history, it communicated different ideas. So that's how you study it. What is the culture imagination? For me, imagination is a very important word, not objectivity. Subjectivity is important, imagination is important, and that's the key words in mythology. And it's not taught in any schools or colleges. You can't do a degree on mythology. You can do a degree in history. But you can't do there is one or two courses. Bombay University has a course, very, very rudimentary. I've done that course. But globally, it's part of anthropology, it's part of literary studies, but religious studies, but then mythology is also secular. So it's a new subject. It's a relatively new. I would say it's the new form is a very new subject. Nobody's figured out how to make it academic.
Right. Do you think that moving forward, history would be less prone to distortion? Because now I think we're keeping a lot more records. Could that be a thing? But is that, do you think, a possible outcome?
Not really. Like, for example, how Gandhi was killed by Godse. Simple story like that, depending on who tells the story, who is receiving the story, how it is presented. Now we live in the world of fake news. You need a lot of work to figure out what actually happened and how do you interpret it. See, it's one thing is the data. The data, I'm sure we can do a refined job and figure it out. But a simple text doesn't capture an emotion. So it's always going to be challenged. What does it mean at that time? For example, when I always tell people, politicians will only use beautiful language in all their billboards, right? Now, the truth of the reality of life and what is there on your poster is not the same. But historians, let's say, have access only to the poster. You will see what a noble king, what a good king.
Right.
We'll never get all the information. History tries very hard and it uses multiple sources and uses many methods to figure out what happened in the past. But it is a very difficult subject. And some people have done fantastic. I mean, it's an ongoing process. Technique, it's scientific technique. So it will always, it is not as simple like, say, engineering, where even engineering is not that simple, but even you have a sense of, at one time we thought the word smallest particle was atoms.
Right.
Then we have subatomic particles. Then now you have waves. Now people are talking about string theory. So as our knowledge improved, as our technology changed, our understanding of science changed. In the same way, history following the scientific process will also change as our techniques change,
right,
as knowledge changes. And so our understanding of Ramayana and Mahabharata today is very different from a historical lens. Mythological lens remains very amorphous right now, but historical lens is very, very vigorous now. We have very good techniques.
Right. I feel one thing that perhaps could be a hindrance as a mythologist for you is that a lot of people take offense to a lot of things because perhaps what you are saying is not consistent with what they've heard. Because that is, I think, partially how it's been passed down, right? You listen to stories and then you realize that the story I heard when I was a kid is not consistent and not aligned with what Mr. Devdutt Pattanaik he's mentioning in his books. So how do you deal with that?
First, one is when one writes book, one doesn't seek approval of people.
Right.
And everybody has their own, mythology being very subjective, everybody has their own version of it. Let's look at Jainism, for example. Digambars will not agree with Shvetambars. Right? The way the various details, one of the biggest challenges I had is when I'm writing on Jainism is, do I take the Jain Digambar version, do I take the Shvetambar version, and then you realize even there are so many layers and layers, just purely looking at institutions, different organizations, different institutions approach things very differently. And then at an individual level, of course there'll be variation. My mother never told me the story, doesn't mean the story doesn't exist.
Right.
If I use my mother as the rate limiting factor of knowledge, then whatever my mother told me is the absolute truth, then that's a very small version of the world. While it's very cute and very sweet and lovable, and I'm sure your mother knew everything about the world, and for you, your mother is the world. But there's a whole world of documentation, inscriptions, storytelling, oral, textual, archaeological, inscription, epigraphic, so many things that we have, large version, all of which needs to be considered. When I'm writing it, I consider quite a bit. Not all of it you can't consider. It's just too vast a subject. You cannot consider everything.
Right. And coming to Jainism, You've written this absolutely beautiful book. It's called Bahubali, 63 Insights into Jainism. Tell us something about that. Why, first of all, the question I have is why Bahubali? I think as a Jain, I feel you could have perhaps gone for any other 24 Tirthankars, but it's just a question, right? Why Bahubali
Yeah.
specifically?
So this question is only asked by Jains, and I notice, you see you must understand that for me, this book is not just meant for Jains; it's also meant for non-Jains.
Absolutely.
Now, when you use the word Bahubali, everybody remembers the name Bahubali because they've heard it in a Bollywood film.
Right.
And it's a super duper hit. And it's a story of a very violent person. And it's a very violent film. It involves a lot of violence. And I was very disturbed when I saw the film because I smiled that the only mythological character where the name Bahubali exists is a non-violent person.
Right.
Unfortunately, every Indian today knows Bahubali as a violent character in Bollywood. So now that means that I have got an entire young population who will pick up the book thinking it is about a Bollywood film.
Right.
Because they've got the name. If I use any other name, it is only the Jain community that will pick it up. The non-Jain will not pick it up. Step one. Step two, this is why it's not the title of the book, it's the title of the first essay.
Right.
So there are 63 essays, and the first essay, it would have been, I could have said 60, it is Bahubali and 62 other insights.
Right.
But then that doesn't give a good sound because I want the word 63 on this book. So it's basically one of the essays, and I know it's part of the Digambar Jain tradition. It's not very strong. In the Shwetambar Jain tradition, Bahubali is not an important character at all. In the Digambar Jain traditions, it is a very powerful character. Now, again, most Indians are familiar with Shravan Benegola. They've seen the big rituals of South India. They've seen it somewhere in the poster. They've seen this Gomateshwar Bahubali somewhere. So again, it's fairly familiar. So that was one of the reasons. The Hindi version, of course, is only called Tirthankar because then it's a very zeroed. We decided to use one. In English, we use Bahubali and then we use Tirthankar for the Hindi. So, which is more generic. But then, because by now people know the book exists. But initially, to get the initial push, you can change titles of books over time. So that's a technical thing. But for me, Bahubali gets me a large access to very large group. The only people who will be a little uncomfortable are the Shwetambars. I'm very aware of it.
Right.
Because in the Shwetambar scheme of things, Bahubali doesn't play such an important role. In fact, perhaps no role at all. But he's there, and for me that became a very good starting point. Also because Bahubali's brother is Bharat, and India is called Bharat, and wonderful for me that this Bharat-India controversy began after the book was published. So I was like, oh, lovely, this is exactly. So who is Bahubali? The brother of Bharat. Right. India is named after which Bharat? Hindu Bharat or Jain Bharat? And I keep asking these questions, and everybody gets uncomfortable with this. But we have to know. We have to raise these questions.
Right. Which one is it though?
We'll never know.
Perhaps that's the case. So, you've obviously researched about Jainism, I think, as you've mentioned, for over 25 years, if I'm not mistaken. If you were to, and now I think it's a very stupid question as well, but if you were to sum up Jainism in a sentence, how would you do that? How would you go about that?
Well, for me, the most important idea is about contentment. The
Right.
key word for me in Jainism is to be so content that you don't consume anything. It goes to the point when you stop consuming anything. So, as human beings and all living organisms are constantly consuming things in order to stay alive. Imagine a point of a moment in time where you're so content that you don't need to consume. And that's, I think, the action, and I think that's a very powerful word that emerged as I wrote this book. And for me, that's what Jainism, in its finest form, it talks about contentment. Really, all Indian philosophies talk about this idea, but it's not foregrounded because nobody realizes it. What is called santosh. Because when you are content, you will not consume. When you won't consume, you won't kill, and therefore ahimsa comes to picture. When you are content, you will not. What do you do with all the things that you possess? You will give it away. So aparigraha becomes important. When you are content, you will not bother, you will not be interested in arguing with people. You will therefore go, because you understand that everybody has a different point of view, and therefore anekantvad comes in. Right. So this one word content helps me understand ahimsa, helps me understand aparigraha, helps me understand Anekantavad, and it's sort of the calm image of the Tirthankar, which is for 2000 years we have this artwork across India, sort of spoke to me in that way, the sense of extreme contentment.
Right. And how is, fundamentally, I'm asking, how is Hinduism different from Jainism?
So, the idea of contentment is there across Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism. So, all the rebirth religions talk about contentment. They approach it very differently.
Mm-hmm.
So, the primary method that is followed in Jainism is fasting and restraint. So, therefore, the Shraman orders, and it does not believe that someone is going to help you reach that point. There's an outer big force out there. You have to figure it out yourself. No matter whether you're king, it doesn't. It's a very personal journey. So, that's a very important idea. In Buddhism, it is more intellectual, therefore you have a lot of these conversations, a lot of schools of thought, very, very contemplative, meditative, but highly intellectual, lots of philosophies, some complex philosophies, and there's always the importance given to the Buddha, who is a semi-historical figure, and also, but basically Buddha plays a very important role. And, and in some schools of Buddhism, you also need the grace of the Buddha to rise up. And then finally in Hinduism, one thing which becomes very, very important is there is a divine entity who will enable you to achieve contentment. So there is a Bhagavan, there is a Prabhu, there is a God, which is not there in Jainism. So that makes Jainism very distinct. It's a very individualistic, personal religion, which doesn't need God, doesn't talk to, honestly, intellectualism is not central to Jainism. It's focused more on practice, especially fasting as a practice, and I think it's a very powerful practice because it sort of helps you understand hunger and contentment. And I think these two are extremely, at least the way I understand it, maybe not be the way it's understood in the Jain world, but when you start looking at the stories and philosophy, see, I always approach subjects through mythology, that is stories. In fact, I do not approach it through philosophy. I'll always approach the stories, and I listen to the stories. And I'd say, what are the stories telling?
Right.
What are the images telling? What are the rituals telling? So my approach is not through, philosophical text said this. I'm more interested in what is the story tell. Because common people don't understand philosophy. Common people understand stories.
Right.
Common people understand symbols. Common people, and that's what when the Paryushan happens and the Kalpasutra is narrated, they're telling you the story, and then you have the symbols being shown to you. And whether you're a Murti Pujak or not a Murti Pujak doesn't matter. The story becomes important, the narrative becomes important, the symbols become important, the ritual becomes important. Whether you want to worship an image or not, the iconography, the ideas, they're there. And remember, literacy was not there in India for a long time. But stories everybody understood, pictures everybody saw, and rituals everyone performed. And these three things are how communication happens. And for me, that's why mythology plays a very important, not philosophy.
Right. And talking about stories, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, there are some stories which are there in Hinduism and Jainism as well. I think the Hindu version is obviously much more popular, and that is what I've grown up on as well. Right. But how is it different? How is it different in Jainism?
So, one of the things, unfortunately, is that Jain temples do not show images of Jain Ramayana and Jain Mahabharata.
Right.
And therefore, it is not very popular. So, at least I haven't seen those images. Maybe they are there in some place, but usually they do not show these images. They focus more on the Yakshas, Yakshis, Gandharvas, and they talk about the Tirthankar specifically, mostly, and maybe some Acharyas, but they do not talk about the Ramayana and Mahabharata. But we know that in Sanskrit, Prakrit, Kannada, Gujarati, there were lots and lots of writings on Jain Ramayana and Jain Mahabharata. Now, Jain Ramayana is usually called Pauma Charita or Padma Charita. So, Ram is considered to be, is called Padma. Now, he's considered to be a Baladeva. So, one of the 63 Mahapurushas. So, there are 63 Mahapurushas who appear regularly on earth, 24 of them being a Tirthankar, 12 of them being Chakravartis, 9 being Vasudevs, 9 being Baladevs, 9 being Prati Vasudevs. So, Ramayana and Mahabharata come in the framework of Baladev, Vasudev, and Prati Vasudev. And in the Ramayana story, the Prati Vasudev is Ravan, the Vasudev is Lakshman, and therefore Lakshman is the one who kills Ravan in the Jain Ramayana, And Ram is the Baladev, and what Baladev chooses non-violence, however, is deeply attached to his brother. So when his brother dies, he's unable to let go of his body, and therefore there's an attachment. Although he chooses non-violence, there is attachment. And therefore, not able to give up the body is a consistent theme. So the Jain Ramayan's unique feature is that Ram is not the one who kills Ravan, it is Lakshman. So the violence is linked to Lakshman, not to Ram. That's the Jain Ramayan. The Jain Mahabharata, the Prati Vasudev is Jarasandha, and the Vasudev happens to be Krishna, and Baladev happens to be Balram. And the battle, therefore, there's no Pandavas, Kauravas play a secondary role, not a primary role. And the real war is called the Harivansha. The battle is, from Magad on one side, which is the eastern part of India, and Dwarka, which is in the western part of India. And so it's a hot war between these. And Kauravas and Pandavas happen to take sides. So the Pandavas take the sides of people in Dwarka, and the Kauravas support Jarasandha. But the war is between Krishna and Jarasandha. And Krishna's story is linked to the Tirthankar Neminath. And Neminath's also very Gujarat-centric practices. And that Gujarat being a major center of Jainism, at least from the 5th century AD, we know that by 10th century it was a very major force, where the Solanki kings were ruling that place, and it's a trading route, a very important trading route. So you find Neminath playing a very important role. As far as Ram is concerned, it is during the era of Muni Suvrat. So Muni Suvrat is there, and therefore you find these kind of it's like a Venn diagram. There are things that are common, there are things that are not common, and there's definitely an exchange of ideas happening between Jainism, and it's both ways, not one way. Both ways. And there are a lot of subsidiary stories, like stories of Pradyumna, the son of Krishna. There is a lot of Jain stories of Pradyumna, and Krishna's extended family has a lot of stories. And if you go to Maharashtra, there are places like Mangi Tungi, where they're linked very strongly with both the Ramayana and the Mahabharata of the Jains.
Right. And we briefly talked about Neminaji and Gujarat, right? And we can't not talk about Girnarji when it comes to that. What exactly is the case with Girnarji? What exactly is the history? Can you tell us something a little bit more about that? Because it feels like there are a lot of narratives around it.
See, one doesn't know these stories. Everybody is. Remember, this is where mythology plays a very important role, and mythology becomes parts of politics because it is about power. Stories shape power. Like, when you talk about Israel says, "This is my promised land. God gave me this land." Now, how do you argue with that? You can't argue with it, right? So, the moment God says, "God gave me this land," then you can't argue with it. Or, you have in the Islamic world, somebody says, "God told me to do this is there in the Quran." Now, you can't argue with that. So that is the power of mythology. It tells you a story which your culture believes in, and you enforce a line. This river came, this river is created by God, God gave us this river, God gave us this mountain, and therefore the ideas, the Jains believe that Girnar, on top of Girnar, is where Neminathji's achieved Nirvan, and that's his highest state, and therefore that makes Girnar mountain very important. There are mountains in Gujarat which are very important, like Palitana mountains, the Shatrunjay mountains, which are linked with the Pandavas achieving, getting their nirvana over there. So you have the Pandavas. So these stories, now there is no way to prove or disprove them. It's a matter of faith. Right. You believe it. And therefore you believe it, and therefore walking up the mountain is a very important ritual. It is there in Shikharji. Mostly in Jainism, most of its centers are in Bihar. But then, as I said, there is a trade route which connects it with Gujarat, and therefore in Gujarat, Girnar and Palitana become important mountains, which are important. But then the mountains are also claimed by other religions, right? So you have, in the old days, you would have Buddhist structures, then you have Hindu structures. Hindus believe that's the place of Dattatreya. Now, historically, where is Dattatreya located? We don't know. There are a lot of Dattatreya shrines in the Krishna River Valley. You have a lot of Dattatreya things in the Godavari belt. You have a lot of Dattatreya shrines in Gujarat, Maharashtra. Dattatreya is linked with Gorakhpur. So these are matters of faith. And the moment they become matters of faith, there's no way to settle it. You need people to have wisdom and help each other figure out a way in which everybody can be happy. but I think we live in territorial times, and जिसके हाथ में लाठी है वो ही decide करता है सब कुछ. So that's become like nobody talks about Ayodhya being a Jain center. We know that many of the Tirthankars have, including Rishabhnath ji, comes from as per stories are from Ayodhya. So Ayodhya is a center of about 4 or 5 Tirthankars. If I'm not Ajit Nath ji, Sumati Nath ji, Abhinandan ji, I'm not all, I mean, the one has to do, there are all these variations, but I know that Ayodhya, when people talk about Ayodhya, they only talk Ram, they never talk about the Jain basis. So Jainism is sort of obscured, nobody remembers the Jain. I remember meeting a very, very senior scholar, Jain scholar, and I said, I went and saw the Basadi in Mangalore, and he said, what is a Basadi? And I was surprised because I thought Jains would know, and I said, but haven't you seen a Basadi? And then I realized he is Shwetambar, and he's all his life he's been walking around Maharashtra, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh. He's not familiar with the temple traditions and the Jain traditions of Karnataka and Budagudri and this Udupi region, which is in the coastal region, which has a lot of the Bahubali temples. I mean, I suddenly realized that because when you go to Gujarat and you go to Palitan, you don't see so many Bahubalis, very few of them. But when you go to southern Karnataka, Dakshin Kannada, you will find these hundreds and hundreds of Bahubalis, not 1 or 2, but hundreds of them. And as you're riding, go through the town, you'll be surprised at the number of mathas there. And they have this South Indian style, which is very different from what you see in the north. But I realized that North Indians don't know about this part. Or when I went to Tamil Nadu and I went to Madurai and I saw the Shamanar hills, I realized that most people don't know that they exist. So many of the mountains are being broken and they all have these carvings of Jain Munis, and the mountains are being broken for quarry reasons. Nobody knows. So you see, what happens is, if you remember, then you set a claim. And then you say, hey, this is my holy place, please at least respect it. And then 2 people ask for the holy place, and then it gets political. And then, well, the politicians seem to be very wise and they'll solve it, I'm sure.
Right. What do you think are the misconceptions around Jainism? The things that people perhaps associate which they should not, if you don't associate which perhaps they should?
Well, I don't know so much about it because I focus on the stories, but I know that most people know Jainism only through Jain food.
Fair.
I don't think most people know, they just know that Jains are people who have peculiar eating habits. When they go to restaurants and say Jain khana chahiye, and they obviously are a very successful business community because everywhere you find that Jain food available here, Jain chole bhature available here, Jain bhelpuri available. So people are like, who are these Jains? So I think for most people, access to Jainism is through the menu card.
Yes.
Because they will say that, there is Jain food available. You go to flights, you go to international flights, they'll say Jain food over there. And I think that is the access point for most Indians, that there is something called Jains. The second access point is businessmen. Maybe they deal with the business, they work for Jain companies, and the third access point for most people is they see the Shramans walking, they find white women wearing white clothes walking, they see men wearing, some of them wearing masks, some of them not wearing clothes. Then you realize, okay, this is some other group. Of course, the holy men in India is not a big deal. Everybody sees holy men everywhere. So that's not really a Jain pehchan, as I would say. Only an educated person would perhaps know कि अच्छा ये Jain. They know that he a holy person है. इसके आगे nobody knows anything. So I think ahimsa is something that intellectually people would associate it with. People go to school. Nowadays, everybody goes to WhatsApp University. So in WhatsApp University, I don't think there's much information on Jainism.
Right. What would you say? Is there any Western philosophy that is perhaps close to Jainism?
So remember, Western philosophy does not believe in rebirth.
Right.
And all Indian philosophy is based on rebirth and therefore karma. That's the foundational difference between Indian philosophy and Western philosophy. Right? They will use any word. That's why they are uncomfortable with. They use words like justice, equality. They will say theism, God. None of these words, justice, equality, God. These 3 words which are very powerful in the Western canon. And by West, I also mean Islam. You remember when you say the West, most people think of the Christian and Jewish countries. They forget Islam. Even the West doesn't like to include Islamic countries as part of the West. They see it as part of the East. And that's their problem. But from Indian point of view, these are religions that believe you live only once, and at the end of it, there is a judgment day. God will judge you for your actions. This concept does not exist in Buddhism, Jainism. It's just not there. We never use it. I always tell people, God doesn't judge. You don't have a concept of, you die and your karmas will sort of float around and decide your fate, and you take decisions based on karma. So there is no concept of judgment day as such, and it's something that is at the heart of it. So when we talk about religions like Christianity and many philosophies, and this is really my contribution to many people don't talk about it. They just assume we are all the same. But I'm like, no, there is this fundamental foundational difference between. I'll give you an example. You talk to people, and whenever I pick up a book on Jainism, which somebody's written, I Google, and if it's a digital book, I'll check for the word evil. And the moment the moment the writer uses the word evil, I know he has not understood Jainism.
Right.
Because evil is a word which only is found in traditions that you live only once.
Right.
The moment you have rebirth, the word evil has no meaning. You have no equivalent of the devil or shaitan in. So I've seen pravachans. I attended once a pravachan of a Jain Muni. He kept using the word shaitan. And I kept quiet because I was like, this is the problem with language. We don't realize. I have seen people. I always say Digambar Parampara is different from Paigambar Parampara. Paigambar Parampara is based on Paigam, message that किसका पैगाम अल्लाह का पैगाम किसके लिए पैगाम आदमी के लिए पैगाम. So there is a very clear पैगाम. This concept of पैगाम doesn't exist in the Digambar tradition. The whole Digambar idea is about letting go. Basically, it's a metaphor for not clinging. That's why I said, when do you let go of things? Now, people, unfortunately, in the 19th century, started using the word he conquers his mind. What it means is, so we use this very warrior language, Mahavir, conquering the mind. But it basically means being content.
Right.
When you're content, you don't think of the day you're very, very content, then you won't hold on to anything, you'll just let go of things.
Right.
So Digambar is supremely content. He's supremely content. Nothing agitates him. And I think that's a very beautiful place to be in, difficult place to be. Because we all cling to things, we cling to objects, we cling to ideas, we cling to so many things. And I think that for me is a very important thing to remember.
Right. In fact, this is actually the last time I had a guest on. This is exactly what we were talking about. He's an author. He's also written this book. It's called "Don't Believe Everything You Think." Right. So, do you think that thinking is the root cause of all suffering? Could that be the case?
Usually, gurus, the people who want to manipulate you will say that.
Okay.
Because they will try to tell you that you shouldn't think, and I'll tell you what to tell you. You should.
Okay. Right.
It's a clever technique which is used by a lot of gurus. Keep them, do meditation, be mindless, don't focus on thought. Go within, and you will find the answer. But basically, the answer is exactly what the guru tells you to do. And basically, before you know it, you are controlled by the guru, and you don't even know. And it's a very good place to be because you don't have to take responsibility, right?
Right.
Say, Atma has told me. Atma has told me. It's like God has told me. Atma has told me. Guru has told me. I don't want to take responsibility. The fact is, we have been given the faculty of the mind. The mind is a crazy thing. It drives us mad, drives us nuts. But we have to live with it. We engage with the world through our mind, through our emotions, through our crazy thoughts. And that's what makes us human. Otherwise, we would be a plant or an animal which does not have these things. You don't have a dog sitting down and thinking about the problems of life. Humans do.
Right.
We think about these things, and which also means we can be foolish, we can be wise. Right? We can have many ideas. So really the mind is... The word manava comes from mana. So the mana is, so that mana is very, very important. In a way you can say Shramana is the hard-working mind. So it's one way of looking at it.
Right. Is contentment not somewhat related to not thinking?
No, it means realizing. It's the end of thinking, where you realize that you don't need so much in life. It's like fasting, right? When you're fasting, it's an act. Is fasting not eating? Is it passive or active? If you ask yourself when you're fasting, is it passive act? मैं खाना नहीं खा रहा हूँ, but you realize there's a lot of activity going on in your body.
Right.
You are dealing with things, your brain, your body, your thirst, everything is working, and then you sort of you are observing why am I needing so much food, because logically you don't need so much food.
Right.
At the very least, we don't need as much food as we are told we need, and we definitely overeat nowadays. But the simple act of not eating is not a passive thing.
Right.
So I am very uncomfortable with people who should not think, and of course, thinking can drive you nuts, and we start assuming that what I think is true and all that kind of things. But if you start observing people around you and seeing how they think, then you will be a little careful with what you think. Because you see, what we do normally, and problem is these words like self-realization, self-help, all these books, even Maslow keeps talking about self-actualization. All these words, self-help, self-actualization, self-realization, do not look at other people.
Right.
There is no sensitivity to the people around you. Start looking at how other people think. Start looking at how other people behave. This awareness of the other will help you understand how you think. And then you'll realize, oh, if that man is thinking in a very foolish way, then I'm also thinking in a foolish way.
Right.
Right? So these are things that we don't pay attention to the other, and this is a very important idea. So when they use the word kevalin in Jainism, they mean the English may believe they are omniscience.
Mm-hmm.
And what does it mean? It means someone who is so sensitive that he can sense what everybody around him is thinking, feeling. He's aware of those around him. So when someone walks in front of him, he can see the insecurity, he can see the hunger, he can see the greed, he can see the trickery, he can see the... So that is the meaning of kevalin. I have reached a point where I don't bring my ego into anything, and I'm able, when I look at you, I know instantly he's frightened, he's nervous, he's angry, he's upset. And the thing is, you also know that you can do nothing about it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Because that person is going to behave according to his nature. And this famous story of Mahavir, where you have this cowherd putting nails in his ears. Why does he put nails in his ears? Because he assumes that the cows were stolen by Mahavir, when Mahavir doesn't even know that these cows were wandering around him, because he was deep in meditation. So a person can, decide, I hate you, and you are just doing nothing. Even if you do nothing, a person can hate you. Even if you're doing nothing, a person can love you. Even if you're doing nothing, that's what happens. And it's something that the Mahavir story which is for me a very powerful story of this cowherd who puts nails in his ears, because he's like, tum sunte nahi ho, tum behre ho kya? And he's imagining all these things in his head. It's all in his head, and Mahavir is just watching this strange behavior happening. Doesn't complain, doesn't say that blame him. He just lets the thing flow. And I think that's not thinking. That's being very aware of what's going on. That's kevalin, the state of kevalin, where you know that you understand what this person is doing, and you also know that no intervention will help him. That person has to just go through this crazy cycle.
Right. And one thing I really want to ask you is something that frustrates me at times is the idea of the Kal Yug. Ya fir, in fact, we have this in Jainism as well. I feel at times people use it as a license for ignorance.
So the Kal Yuga concept appears in history only after the 5th century AD. The first inscription is found in South India, and the Pallava kings used the word Kal Yuga for the first time, which means 2000 years ago nobody used the word. If you met Ashoka, he would not know what Kal Yuga means. All these concepts of time and the cyclical time, which you find in Kalpa Sutra and all that, were written much later. We will say that they are thousands and millions of years old, but the documented evidence that we have is that this idea of cyclical time comes much later in Indian traditions, and it emerges very later. But it's basically a way of saying that the world is coming to an end, and this kings were told that the world is coming to an end, and if you intervene, it will come back to life. That was the reason why they came up with this idea, that basically Kali Yuga is a metaphor for a chaotic ecosystem. It's not objective, it is subjective.
Right.
Remember, its mythology is always subjective, it is never objective. So it says, the world looks chaotic, you are the one who is going to bring order into it. And therefore the kings were very powerful, and the kings said, okay, I'll bring order into it. Remember, the word Raja comes from the word Arajakta. जब राजा होता है तो अराजकता समाप्त होता है. Arajakta is Kali Yuga. Right?
But the way
that's how stories are told.
Right, but the way it's been perceived right now is, if anything, the opposite of that. If I just feel people, the way people see it is that we cannot do anything about anything at all because everything is going to be destroyed, essentially. Right?
Yeah.
That seems like a very negative way of looking at it in life in general, I feel.
See, the thing is, human beings are very clever animals. We can twist and turn things in any way, right? The fact is, if the person who says we can do nothing about it, now the moment he wants to go to the toilet, he does go to the toilet.
Yeah. Huh?
He doesn't
Fair.
say, oh, I can do nothing about it. It just happens. No,
Right.
it doesn't. You go to the loo. When you're hungry, you go to the... So the fact is, you don't let it, you actually do an action. You don't say, jo hona hai, hota hi rahega. You just don't, open your bowels in the front room of the house. You run to the toilet.
Right.
The fact is, you take an action. And when you're hungry, people say that, I don't want to work, I don't want to take up a job. I said, fantastic, don't work. But how will you feed yourself? Mummy, Papa are not going to feed you, right?
Right.
So then they said, oh, I said, you don't need motivation. One day hunger, motivation will come. You will figure it out, right? You have to survive. So nature has an inbuilt motivation and drive system. It is called hunger. तुमको भूख लगती है, तो भूख के लिए तुम उठोगे और काम करना शुरू करोगे. Right? Now the Tirthankars and all are talking about this motivation and drive and how it's sort of over time we are not content with food. We start accumulating stuff. We want more and more and more and more. And I said, what's doing? Why are we doing that? Where is that coming from? And is it necessary to do that? And that's the conversation that the Shramanas are having. They're like, hey, I need food, but I don't need to be addicted to food. And then that is where contentment happens. How much do you need? Now the question is, what about Swadharma? You're capable. I always ask this question to my Jain business friends. I said, you are content with 100 rupees, but you're capable of generating 1,000 rupees. Will you earn 1,000 or will you earn 100? What will you do with the extra 900?
Right.
Because if you're content, the 900 is useless. Now comes the principle of aparigraha. What do you do with the 900? If you're not holding on to it, will you just give it away to people? But then that will create its own issues. If you just let money float into the market, that will create a lot of chaos.
What is usually the answer to that?
There is no answer. I mean, there is an answer if you buy my book.
Right. And one thing I heard you talk about, I've heard you talk about it multiple times. I absolutely love it. And I think this is something a lot of people should know. I think I heard you talk about it around 2020. Absolutely love the concept. Absolutely love the definition. And that is the difference between Jai and Vijay. This is something I feel everybody should know about. I think everybody should lead a life which is, I call it Jai-centric. Jai, not exactly Jai-centric, but Jai-oriented, right? Can you please talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is, I think you're referring to my book Mahabharata,
Yes.
originally called Jai Samhita.
Right.
And I always noticed that the doorkeepers of Vaikuntha are called Jai and Vijay. And I asked one Hindi scholar, why are there two words in Jai or Vijay? And he just made a very casual, I don't think he realized the implications of what he was telling me. He said, विजय में कोई पराजय होता है और जय में कोई पराजय नहीं होता क्योंकि आप अपने आप के ऊपर विजय प्राप्त
Right.
The same idea, the idea that your battle is with yourself and your thoughts and your minds and your insecurities, that is where the battle is. And see, that idea comes in the name Mahavir. There's Veer and Mahavir. The Veer is fighting the demons outside. The Mahavir is fighting the demons inside. And Jai is about winning this inner war of, and then that's where your discontentment comes from. Remember, even the Buddha talks about desire is the cause of suffering. That's the English translation. But the Prakrit meaning is dukkha happens where there's tanna, thirst. Wherever there is thirst, wherever there is hunger, there is suffering. So if you want to be at peace, you should end hunger, which is contentment. And therefore, even Buddhism talks about contentment in strange. Is that our biggest conquest is with our discipline, is with this. We are constantly wanting to, even all these businessmen want to deflate, we want to defeat Pakistan. I see people who are unemployed are obsessed with defeating Pakistan. I said, or, people, who are overweight are obsessed with Pakistan. I'm like, why can't you battle your stomach and your body and your weight issues or your health issues or your personal life issues. Your wife hates you, your children hate you, your job hates you, you are angry with the world, but somehow defeating Pakistan will give you a lot of excitement. I mean, you just have to go to, go to Jalandhar and you go to see that India-Pakistan border, people behaving very strangely. And I just don't get it. I mean, like, how is that helping you in any way? I would rather, my joy is if I go to the temples and I see these images of these, and they'll always tell the Tirthankars come from royal families. Why are they always telling you they come from royal families? Because they come from very successful backgrounds. They have a lot of money, power. It's not that kuch nahi tha and they let it go. They're everything that you can imagine. But then it's a conscious decision where they say, and I believe it's a metaphor. It's not physical letting go, it's psychological letting go. It's a psychological journey that we are in. And I think the Shram is about the mind. So Jaya is about the battlefield of the mind. And I think Indian thought, that's what makes Indian thought unique. Everything revolves around the mind. It's all about the mind. Ramayana is about the mind. Mahabharata is about the mind. All problems, all solutions are in the mind. And I think that's what makes Indian thought, Jain thought, Buddhist thought powerful.
Is there a response to nihilism in Jainism? It's a very, I think, out of the way question, but I just wanted to know that I think at times it is very easy for a person to zoom out and just feel as if your actions don't mean anything, because in the long run, in the grand scheme of things, they don't mean anything. Go on, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I completely understand what you're saying. Nihilism is a very good thing. I always tell people who are nihilistic that, okay, wonderful, let's wait for 24 hours and talk about it. Because nobody's going to give you food for 24 hours, and then let me see what happens to your nihilism.
Right.
Most people who talk about atheism, nihilism, all these big ideas are usually people who are well fed and who have a regular source of income and are getting food, their wives are serving them food. And they say, Dunya mein sab kaam chhod do. And your wife is cooking food for you. At 9 o'clock when you don't get your meal, you are the one who will shout and say, you can talk all these big. At the end of the day, we should ask this by a very simple question. Khana kahan se milega? Nihilist okay, because khana kaise milega? Chhod do na. Why do you want to see? Basically, people who are control freaks and who want to control the world and want the world to run as per their rules are the ones who get frustrated. A content person, that's why the word Dhamma is used in Buddhism. But see the world for what it is. It runs without you. Human beings, the greatest fear of human beings is the realization that the world doesn't need anyone. It doesn't need you, it doesn't need me, there's nothing. It's just going on. I mean, everyone who wants to save the world, who wants to be a great leader, is going to be frustrated because nobody needs you. Nobody needs you. And I think that's a very frustrating idea. And you said, it's like saying, मैं तुमसे बात नहीं करूँगा. मत करो. Nihilist is basically saying, मैं दुनिया से बात नहीं करूँगा. And वो बोले कि ठीक है भैया, कुछ फर्क नहीं पड़ता है. You're not that important. Nobody's that important. If somebody says, I'm going to kill myself, please don't. But if you do, the world just continues. We don't want you to die. It's not. There's so much wonderful things to experience in this world. But the idea that human beings, and that's our ego, that I will change the world. Mm-hmm. One man will make a difference. Be the change. Anyway, I don't want to change the world. The world is changing anyway. Do what you can do. If you want to change things, can you just be content? Find things in your mind. The great battle in your mind when you can say that instead of 2 rotis, I'll eat 1. That's a huge, difficult battle. It's a very difficult battle.
Right. And now I think we don't have a lot of time left, but I just want to ask you last question. And that is, if a person is to take one thing from Jainism, what should it be? And why, obviously?
Well, I think that was the first question too. I think it's about...
that was about summing up. This is essentially what is the one principle one should take from Jainism?
Contentment.
Right, fair enough.
I'll always go to contentment because that's the image. Whenever you see an image of the Tirthankaras, and I'd like to tell you, Bahubali story, how do you differentiate between a Bahubali image and a Jain Tirthankar image? A Tirthankar, when he stands, both of them are standing perfectly. There's only one difference. There's the only way to catch the difference. That this is not a Tirthankar statue. This is the Bahubali statue. There are vines on his feet.
Right.
But this means he's still in attachment. He's still bound to the earth. He's not able to rise that above. Now, what is blocking it is the assumption that I can run away from a world, if you look at the story of Bahubali, is where there will be no hierarchies.
Right.
Everywhere, anywhere, internally, externally, in the monastery, in the kingdom, wherever you go, there will be someone above you, someone below you. ये दुनिया में नहीं बदलने वाला है. And that is the struggle. When you let go, that one day there will be a world where there will be no hierarchy, there will be no boundaries. And that's a very visual, powerful thing when the Tirthankar is sitting there calmly and looking at this man who is hoping for utopia. And the sage telling him, this is it. This is the world. You are never going to get it. And that's what is binding him. And therefore the Bahubali, the mighty Bahubali, the word Bahubali means a mighty person, is not able to let go of this world. Just a छोटी चीज की देखिए दुनिया को कंट्रोल नहीं कर पाएगा. It will always, you may not believe in hierarchy, but the world around you believes in this, and they'll work with it, and you will have to live in an ocean of ignorance. Even if you are wise, doesn't mean the world will become wise.
Right. Well, this was very insightful. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for coming on. And everyone, please have a look at this book. It is called Bahubali. Please go ahead and buy it. I've read it. It is wonderful. One thing, last thing that I want to ask you, you've published over 50 books. What number is this? Everywhere I've read, it says 50 plus, right? Do you even know which one is it?
The reason is a technical reason, because many of the books are children's books and we combine them to make an omnibus. So if there are, let's say, 6 children's books and they become one book, so is it 6 books or one of 6 books?
Right.
So it's a technical reason. So like a small book of 4,000 words for children, does it qualify as a book or as one part of a series? So that becomes it's a technical definition problem. Also, many of the books are translated.
Right.
And where do I locate the translated? So all that, and some of the translated books are not translated. I've actually spoken in Hindi and they've been transcribed. So, do I count only English books? Do I also count non-English books? All that poses a lot of technical problems. So 50 plus is an easy way of saying. 50
right.
plus, 25 plus, it's easy to remember. And how does it matter what's exact objective?
Anyway, I think that's a fantastic problem to have anyway, isn't it?
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming on. It really, really means a lot. Thank you.